Remember Jerry Springer, the show where ordinary conflicts were staged, amplified, and turned into spectacle? Not because conflict is naturally that intense, but because someone figured out that conflict drives ratings. I want you to hold that image for this entire episode because what happened to daytime television in the 1990s has happened to the American public square in the 2020s, and the consequences are significantly more serious than bad TV. Tonight on Words with Wentz, we are documenting the three-part system that has replaced the public square with a compliance machine. First, how algorithms engineered outrage for profit, manufacturing the chaos that justified what came next. Second, how governments used that chaos to outsource censorship to corporations, no government agency required. And third, how speech definitions are now being written into law, and what the man who wrote the most important one says about what is being done with it. The First Amendment says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. What happens when they don't have to? Social media platforms are not neutral hosts. They are stage managers. The algorithm does not care whether the content it amplifies is true, healthy, or democratic. It cares whether it generates engagement, clicks, shares, comments, time on screen. And the content that generates the most engagement is high arousal, low nuance content. Outrage, fear, tribal conflict, us versus them. This is not an accident. It is an incentive structure. Platforms are advertising businesses. Their product is your attention. The more intensely they can hold it, the more they can charge for access to it. When platforms optimize for engagement, they optimize for conflict. And when the entire public square is optimized for conflict, something predictable happens. The square becomes unmanageable. And an unmanageable square needs management. That is where the government enters, not to fix the platform's incentive structure, not to make it less addictive or more honest, but to use the resulting chaos as a justification for something else entirely, the right to define what can and cannot be said on it. The platform manufactured the crisis. The government stepped in with the solution, and the solution was not less outrage, it was less speech. Here is how modern digital censorship actually works, and it does not look like what most people imagine. There is no government bureau reviewing your posts. There is no federal official reading your tweets. What there is liability. The European Union's Digital Services Act, which entered into force in 2024, requires platforms to remove content defined as illegal or face fines of up to 6% of their global annual revenue. 6% of $1 trillion company is a number that concentrates minds very quickly. Platforms do not respond to that liability by hiring more human reviewers who can evaluate context and nuance. That is too slow and too expensive. They respond by building automated compliance filters, lines of code that scan for patterns and remove content before it ever reaches an audience. These filters do not care about your argument. They do not understand your context. They look for keywords, phrases, and patterns, and they flag or remove content that matches. In the United States, the mechanism is slightly different, but the result is the same. Florida legislation requires state contractors to certify they do not boycott Israel, making the economic condition of doing business with the state contingent on a specific political position. This is not a speech law in the traditional sense. It bypasses the First Amendment by attaching the speech restriction to a business contract, not a criminal statute. The government does not have to censor you directly. It simply makes the platform, or the contractor, liable for your speech, and they do the rest. Here is the constitutional trap at the heart of this system. The First Amendment prohibits government from abridging freedom of speech. It does not prohibit private companies from doing so. When you post on a social media platform, you are on private property, and private property owners can set their own rules. That was a reasonable legal framework when the public square was literally a public square, government-owned, government-regulated, First Amendment protected. It becomes significantly more complicated when the public square is a handful of private platforms through which the majority of American civic life now flows. When losing your account means being, in the words of researchers who study this, cut off from your networks and audiences, professionally, politically, personally. The government understood this before most citizens did. If you cannot regulate speech directly, the First Amendment stops you. You can regulate the platforms that carry it, make them liable for it, Watch them self-regulate in ways that no government agency could legally mandate. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is the documented architecture of the EU Digital Services Act, multiple state-level contractor certification laws, and the Antisemitism Awareness Act, which passed the House of Representatives 320-91 on May 1, 2024, requiring the Department of Education to apply a specific speech definition when evaluating campus discrimination. The private platform becomes the enforcement arm of the public regulation. The First Amendment was never designed for this arrangement. I want to give you the most important specific example of what compliance-led oversight looks like in practice. In May 2024, the House of Representatives passed the Antisemitism Awareness Act by a vote of 320-91. The bill requires the Department of Education to use the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IHRA, working definition of antisemitism when enforcing federal civil rights law on college campuses. Here is why that matters. The IHRA definition includes among its examples of antisemitism, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, and drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. In practical terms, that means certain criticisms of Israeli government policy, constitutionally protected political speech under the First Amendment, could be categorized as anti-Semitism under a federal enforcement standard. Now here is the most remarkable fact in this episode. The man who drafted the IHRA definition, Professor Kenneth Stern, director of the Bard Center for the Study of Hate, testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee in September 2024 against its use in legislation. His own words, "Once the door is open to using a tool like IHRA via law to suppress speech, partisans stretch and bend and use it in any way they can to achieve their political goals, knowing even if they don't win a particular case, the threat is enough to chill speech through law." A federal court in Texas agreed. In October 2024, Judge Pittman found that enforcing the IHRA definition chills political speech that is, in his words, fundamental to the university experience. The man who wrote the definition says, "Don't use it as law." A federal judge says enforcing it chills First Amendment speech. The House of Representatives passed it 320-91 anyway. After Florida adopted the IHRA definition into state law in 2024, the University System of Florida sent an email to its institutions requiring a review of courses for, quote, anti-Semitism or anti-Israel bias. The universities were instructed to conduct a keyword search on course descriptions and syllabi. The keywords flagged for review included Israel, Israeli, Palestine, Palestinian, Middle East, Zionism, Zionist, Judaism, Jewish, and Jews. That is a list that would flag courses in history, religion, political science, international relations, language, and literature, a course on the Old Testament, a course on the Holocaust, a course on the Arab-Israeli conflict, a course on comparative religion. Professor Stern documented this in his Senate testimony. The Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, FIRE, stated that singling out certain keywords and phrases for targeted review will certainly chill speech on these important issues. This is what compliance-led oversight looks like when it lands at the classroom level, not a government official deciding what you can teach. A keyword search, automated, opaque, applied uniformly, that determines which courses require review and which professors may face scrutiny for what they assigned. The algorithm did not replace the professor, but it moved into the same building. Let me bring this back to the question I opened with. The First Amendment says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. It is one of the most powerful legal protections ever written. But what the events of this episode document is a system that has largely learned to work around it, not by passing speech laws, those would be struck down, but by engineering a set of conditions under which speech is curtailed without a law ever being required. Algorithms that reward outrage and suppress nuance, no law required. Liability frameworks that make platforms self-censor to avoid fines, no speech law required. Contractor certification requirements that attach political conditions to economic participation, no First Amendment trigger required. Speech definitions written into regulatory enforcement that a federal judge says chill protected political expression, passed with bipartisan enthusiasm. The question this episode asks you to sit with is this: If you must pass a compliance test before your speech reaches an audience, if the condition of being heard is algorithmic approval, platform policy acceptance, and regulatory definition clearance, are you actually free to speak? The First Amendment was written for a world where the government was the primary threat to speech. We now live in a world where the most effective threats to speech are automated, corporate, and legally constructed to bypass the amendment entirely. That is not a partisan observation. The man who wrote the IHRA definition is not a radical. He is a civil liberties scholar who testified before the Senate that the tool he created is being weaponized against the very speech it was designed to protect. The documents are in the description. This is Words with Wentz. Know your rights.